6,000 years ago, someone in a small mud brick village pressed a reed into wet clay and changed the world forever. They didn't know it. They were just counting sacks of grain. But that simple mark was the beginning of writing, of cities, of civilization itself. And it happened in a strip of land between two rivers that you've probably never thought twice about. You know this place by its Greek name, Mesopotamia. It means land between the rivers, and those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They cut through what is now Iraq, feeding soil so rich that early farmers called it a gift from the gods. Why here? Why did this particular stretch of dirt become the birthplace of cities, laws, and empires? The answer starts with mud. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded every year, but unpredictably, sometimes violently. That unpredictability forced people to cooperate. You couldn't survive alone out there. You needed canals, dikes, and shared labor just to keep your crops alive. Researchers like archaeologist Robert McAdams, who spent decades studying the settlement patterns of ancient Iraq, argued that this need for large-scale irrigation may have been one of the forces that pushed scattered farming communities into the world's first cities. Picture it. Around 3,500 BCE, in a place called Uruk, thousands of people are living closer together than humans ever had before. There are no traffic laws, no police, no precedent for any of this. How do you keep order when 10,000 strangers share a single water supply? The people of Uruk found an answer, and it wasn't violence. It was bureaucracy. That's where the clay tablets come in. The earliest writing wasn't poetry or prophecy. It was inventory. Who owns this many sheep? Who delivered this much barley? Who owes what to whom? Assyriologist Jean Botero, one of the most influential scholars of Mesopotamian texts, spent his career showing just how deeply administrative this culture was at its core. Numbers came before stories. Receipts came before religion, at least on paper. And from those receipts, something extraordinary emerged. Writing didn't stay simple for long. Within a few centuries, the same wedge-shaped marks used to count grain were being used to record laws, myths, and the names of kings. This script is called Cuneiform, and it would be used for over 3,000 years, longer than the Latin alphabet has existed so far. Doesn't that put things in perspective? An entire system of human knowledge, born from farmers tracking their harvests, outlasting most of what came after it. Mesopotamia wasn't one civilization. It was a long relay race of them. The Sumerians built the first cities. Then came the Akkadians, who, under a ruler named Sargon, created what many historians consider the first true empire, a state that stretched across multiple cities and cultures under one ruler. Then the Babylonians. Then the Assyrians. Each one absorbed the last, kept what worked, and added their own ambitions on top. You've probably heard of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king famous for his code of laws. But have you ever actually thought about what those laws reveal? They weren't written to be fair by our standards. They were written to be predictable. If you do this, this happens. No appeals to mercy, no vague principles, just outcomes. Historian Mark van de Meeroop, who has written extensively on the ancient Near East, has pointed out that Hammurabi's code likely functioned less as a strict legal rulebook and more as a kind of royal propaganda, a public demonstration that the king brought order to chaos. Sound familiar? Every ruler since has wanted people to believe the same thing about them. So how does a civilization like this fall? You might imagine some single catastrophic event, a war, an invasion, a king's fatal mistake. But the real story is slower and in some ways stranger. Start with the land itself. All that irrigation that made Mesopotamia thrive also worked against it. Over centuries, the water evaporating from canals left salt behind in the soil. Crop yields slowly dropped. Some ancient texts even complain about fields turning white, as if the earth itself were giving up. The very thing that built these cities was quietly poisoning the ground beneath them. Isn't there something unsettling about a civilization undone by its own ingenuity? Then there's the matter of empires growing too big to manage. The Assyrian Empire, at its height, controlled a vast territory through military force and intimidation. Conquered cities were taxed heavily, and resistance was crushed without mercy. This worked for a while, but fear is an expensive way to hold a kingdom together. It requires constant war, constant tribute, constant vigilance. When the pressure finally broke, in the late 7th century BCE, the collapse was fast. The capital city of Nineveh fell to a coalition of enemies in 612 BCE, and within just a few years, an empire that had dominated the region for centuries simply ceased to exist. But here's what's strange. The cities themselves didn't vanish overnight. Babylon, in particular, kept going. Under a later king named Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon became one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world. Famous for its walls, its temples, and according to later writers, its hanging gardens. Though archaeologists still debate whether those gardens were even in Babylon at all. Doesn't it make you wonder how much of ancient history we've simply taken on faith? Eventually, though, even Babylon's power faded. The Persian Empire absorbed it in 539 BCE, and from there, Mesopotamia became a province rather than a center of power. Cities that had once been the heart of human civilization slowly became provincial towns under foreign rule. The rivers kept flowing, the fields kept being farmed, but the political world that had defined this region for nearly 3,000 years was gone. And yet, calling this a fall might be misleading. Nothing about Mesopotamian civilization truly disappeared. It transformed piece by piece into everything that came after it. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle. These mathematical systems trace back to the Sumerians' base 60 number system, and you use them every single day without a second thought. When you check the time, you're using a system invented by people who lived in mud brick cities 5,000 years ago. Even the stories carried forward. Long before there was a flood story in the book of Genesis, there was a flood story in Mesopotamian mythology, found in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Scholars have spent generations tracing the connections between these ancient narratives and the ones that came later, not to diminish either tradition, but to show how deeply interconnected human storytelling has always been. Isn't it strange to think that a story you might know from childhood has roots reaching back to clay tablets buried in the desert for thousands of years? So what actually caused the fall of Mesopotamia? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe nothing really fell at all. The cities crumbled. The empires dissolved. The kings were forgotten by everyone except archaeologists and historians digging through the dirt centuries later. But the ideas survived. Writing survived. Law codes survived. Mathematics survived. Even agriculture in its basic form survived. What we call a fall might really just be the slowest, quietest kind of handoff in human history. One civilization passing its tools to the next, without ceremony, without anyone fully realizing what was happening. The Sumerians didn't know they were inventing writing for all of humanity. Hammurabi didn't know his laws would influence legal thinking thousands of years later. The scribes counting grain in Uruk certainly didn't know they were laying the foundation for everything from contracts to calendars. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Civilizations end, but the things people build inside them rarely do. They scatter. They get absorbed. They show up later in places no one would expect. Hidden inside our clocks, our laws, our stories, our numbers. So the next time you check the time or sign a contract or hear an old story about a flood that nearly destroyed the world, remember where it started. It started in the mud, between two rivers, with someone pressing a reed into clay just to keep track of their grain. They had no idea what they were building, and neither, really, do we.